In today's striking story, we will learn about Blake, a young executive who seemed to have everything under control. A promising career, gigantic ambitions, and an unshakable belief that the world should adapt to the pace of his achievements. He invested in comfort and exclusivity to ensure his success, without caring about who was left behind. But during a business flight, Blake is confronted with an unexpected situation, an elderly, frail woman who needed his help. His reaction? Coldness and indifference. After all, he believed the world couldn't stop for other people's problems. He needed to be productive. He needed to win. What Blake didn't imagine was that, just 24 hours later, this same woman would appear in a place he would never expect. A place where his arrogance and choices would be put to the test. What seemed like just another ordinary day turned into a lesson Blake would never forget. Get ready for a story that will touch your heart, challenge your convictions, and show you that many times the people we ignore may be the ones who can most change our destiny. And before we dive into this story that will impress you, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you have access to real stories that will make you laugh, cry, and reflect. Subscribe now. Grab some popcorn because today's impressive story is about to begin. The airport was packed that early morning. The sound of loudspeakers announcing flights blended with the buzz of people carrying luggage and going about their lives. Amid the crowd, Blake, a young executive impeccably dressed in a fine-cut suit, seemed indifferent to it all. He stood out, not for his charm, but for the impatience etched on his face. The watch on his wrist was his worst enemy at that moment. Every 3 minutes, he glared at it as if blaming time for not passing faster. Blake had an important meeting the next day, a negotiation that could change his career forever. He had invested heavily in this trip, a first-class ticket strategically chosen to ensure comfort, silence, and, above all, productivity. But there in the boarding line, the chaos around him felt like a needle bursting the balloon of perfection he tried to inflate. The slow-moving line seemed like a test of patience he wasn't willing to endure. "Excuse me, do premium passengers also need to wait in line?" His voice cut through the air, laden with irritation. The tone carried not just impatience, but superiority. Some people around glanced at him uncomfortably, while others simply looked away, perhaps to avoid conflict. Blake didn't care. To him, all of this was an unnecessary obstacle in his perfectly laid-out plan. With each step the line took, he let out quiet sighs, demonstrating an irritation that seemed boundless. His hands fidgeted impatiently with his suitcase, while he mentally rehearsed what he would do as soon as he boarded the plane. He could already picture the comfortable chair, the ample legroom, and the moment he would open his laptop to work on the numbers for a spreadsheet he needed to send before landing. Blake couldn't wait to leave behind the crowd that, in his view, only slowed life down. When it was finally his turn to board, Blake walked with firm steps, not looking at anyone, his mind full of thoughts about work and success. To him, the world around was just background noise in his race to achieve his goals. The young executive was so focused on his plans that he barely noticed the elderly woman behind him, struggling to hold onto the handle of her suitcase. She coughed, trying to mask her fatigue, but Blake didn't notice. Or if he did, he didn't care. He had more important things on his mind. As he crossed the airplane door, he took a deep breath. Finally, the chaos of the line was behind him. In Blake's mind, the flight was a means to an end. Precious time to prove to the world that he was unstoppable. Little did he know that this journey would be much more than just a trip from one city to another. Upon entering the first-class cabin, Blake felt an immediate sense of relief. It was as if the chaotic world of the airport had been left outside, and he could finally breathe. The environment seemed tailor-made for someone like him. Spacious, leather-covered seats, a pleasant silence contrasting with the bustle of the economy class, and attendants ready to meet every need. He looked around, analyzing the details with a satisfied gaze, as if he had achieved something few could enjoy. Blake settled into his seat, stretched his legs, feeling the comfort of the space he had paid for. His always racing mind took a brief pause. For the first time that day, he managed to relax, at least for a moment. He carefully scanned his surroundings, looking for any sign that might threaten his tranquility. Noticing there were no children or distractions nearby, he nodded to himself, confirming that he had made the right decision investing in that seat. The young executive placed his carry-on in the overhead compartment and carefully took out his laptop, placing it on the adjustable table in front of him. He had a clear plan. Make the most of the flight to get ahead on his tasks and ensure the negotiation awaiting him the next day would be a success. To him, that space was more than just a place to sit. It was a symbol of everything he had been working toward in recent years. The comfort of first class was, in his view, a reflection of his dedication and ambition. He deserved to be there. A flight attendant passed by offering a glass of champagne, but Blake declined. He didn't want anything to distract him at that moment. Instead, he adjusted the seat back, reclining just enough to be comfortable as he began typing furiously on the keyboard. To him, productivity was everything. The time there wasn't to be wasted looking out the window or interacting with other passengers. The exclusivity of that space allowed him to maintain absolute control over his priorities. As the plane began taxiing, he adjusted his seatbelt and prepared for what he considered a productive and, above all, quiet flight. Or at least that was what he believed until that moment. The plane was cruising at altitude when the pilot announced they would face a turbulent zone in the coming minutes. The words made some passengers exchange worried glances, but Blake didn't even lift his eyes from his screen. Immersed in his work, he typed with almost mechanical precision, finalizing an important spreadsheet. To him, it was just another inconvenience that had no relevance to his controlled and focused world. When the turbulence began, the plane shook intensely. Passengers gripped the armrests, and some became visibly nervous. The seatbelt light came on, and a flight attendant hurried to ensure everyone was properly secured. Blake, indifferent, adjusted his laptop on the table, trying to ignore the jostling that made him repeatedly correct his posture. However, the turbulence had a different impact on one specific passenger, an elderly woman seated further back. Her trembling hands clung to the armrest in front of her, while her face turned pale. Her chest rose and fell at an accelerated pace, and her coughing was a clear sign that something was wrong. She closed her eyes briefly, as if gathering strength to endure the discomfort. A flight attendant, noticing the situation, quickly approached the elderly woman, trying to comfort her. "Ma'am, are you feeling all right? Do you need anything?" The woman could barely respond, nodding her head with difficulty while clutching her chest. It was evident that the turbulence had taken a significant toll on her fragile health. Blake noticed the movement around him but remained still, his eyes glued to his laptop. He could hear bits of the conversation between the flight attendant and the woman, but chose to ignore it. To him, it was someone else's problem, something that should be handled by those responsible. For a brief moment, he even thought that the commotion might disrupt his concentration, but he quickly dismissed the thought, focusing once more on the numbers filling his screen. As the turbulence began to subside, the elderly woman remained visibly unwell. The flight attendant called for assistance from another crew member to assess how she could be made more comfortable. The woman's frailty and her struggle to stay stable were evident to everyone. Everyone except Blake, who with an impressive coldness stayed detached. To him, the flight had just one purpose: to be productive. The frailty of that elderly woman was a stark contrast to Blake's indifference, as he continued typing as if nothing around him mattered. The storm outside the plane had passed, but inside, the tension remained, silent, like a shadow beginning to hover over the tranquility Blake so desperately sought. He could hardly imagine how much that moment would mark him. As soon as the turbulence subsided and the plane stabilized, the flight attendant turned her attention to the elderly woman. The lady was still visibly unwell, breathing heavily and holding onto the seat beside her for support. The crew's concern was evident. A quick decision needed to be made to ensure she had the comfort required to recover from her malaise. The flight attendant glanced around, evaluating her options, until her eyes landed on Blake, sitting comfortably in first class. He seemed oblivious to the elderly woman's discomfort, his eyes fixed on his laptop and fingers typing rapidly as though the world around him didn't exist. The attendant took a deep breath, adjusted her uniform, and approached him. "Sir, I'm sorry to bother you, but we have a situation here," she began with a polite and professional tone. An elderly passenger became ill during the turbulence and needs a bit more comfort. We'd like to ask if you'd be willing to temporarily give up your seat so she can feel better. Blake paused his typing, looked up, and stared at the attendant. His expression was clearly one of irritation. He glanced briefly at the elderly woman, assessing the situation, then turned his gaze back to the flight attendant. "Give up my seat? Sorry, but that's not an option," he replied firmly. The attendant tried to explain the importance of her request. "I understand, sir, but this is about a passenger who truly needs to rest. Her health is at risk, and we believe first class would be the ideal place for her to recover." Blake crossed his arms, leaned back in his seat, and responded with a tone bordering on sarcasm. "I paid a lot for this seat, and I paid for a reason, to work in peace. If I move, how will I concentrate? Do you even know how much my time is worth?" The attendant maintained her composure but was clearly surprised by Blake's response. She tried again. "Sir, we understand your need for productivity, but this would only be for a brief period. We need to ensure all passengers are well." Blake raised a finger as if he were about to give a lecture. "I'm not responsible for that. I have important work to do, and I'm not going to give up my seat just because someone couldn't handle a little turbulence. Please find another passenger to help." Blake's refusal was like a cold splash of water. The flight attendant looked at him, disappointed, but she knew that pushing further could escalate the tension. Meanwhile, the elderly woman, still standing and leaning on the seat beside her, gave a faint smile of understanding, as if she were accustomed to reactions like Blake's. As the flight attendant moved away from Blake, still searching for a solution for the elderly woman's discomfort, a man sitting on the other side of the cabin observed the situation intently. He was a calm-looking passenger, dressed casually, with a demeanor that exuded empathy. Each weak cough from the elderly woman seemed to deepen his reflection on the scene before him. Finally, the man stood up, adjusting his jacket, and approached the woman. "Excuse me," he said calmly, leaning slightly to speak to her. "Please take my seat. It will be much more comfortable for you to rest there." The elderly woman, surprised by the gesture, looked at him with tired but grateful eyes. "I wouldn't want to trouble you," she said weakly, but he smiled and shook his head, as if to say it was no trouble at all. "It's no trouble. In fact, it would be an honor to help," he insisted. The flight attendant, relieved by his offer, quickly guided the elderly woman to the passenger's seat, fastening her seatbelt and offering her a pillow to make her more comfortable. The elderly woman sat down slowly, visibly thankful, and gently squeezed the man's arm in gratitude. He responded with a kind smile before stepping away to find a seat in economy class, asking for nothing in return. Meanwhile, Blake, who had watched the entire scene from his seat, simply rolled his eyes. His expression was one of impatience, as though this act of kindness was an unnecessary distraction in the productive environment he so valued. He adjusted his laptop and resumed typing, completely ignoring the scene that had just unfolded. For the other passengers, the man's gesture seemed to change the atmosphere in the cabin. His generosity brought a breath of humanity to an environment that had been tense moments earlier due to Blake's refusal. The flight attendant, visibly moved, thanked the kind passenger, whose act of altruism starkly contrasted with Blake's coldness. When the plane landed, Blake closed his laptop with relief. He felt that his time had been well spent. He packed his belongings with almost mechanical precision, put on his blazer, and impatiently waited for the doors to open. He was eager to leave and prepare for the decisive meeting he had the next day. As passengers began to disembark, Blake maintained his firm posture, walking briskly with his eyes fixed straight ahead. Entering the airport terminal, Blake quickly spotted a familiar figure amidst the crowd. William, his boss. William's presence at the airport was unexpected and, for Blake, fraught with tension. Why is he here? Blake thought as he adjusted his tie. His heart raced. He knew William only showed up in extremely important situations. Blake tried to control his anxiety as he approached William, but he was stunned to realize that his boss's gaze wasn't directed at him. William was focused on someone walking slowly behind Blake. When he turned to see who it was, his heart nearly stopped. It was the elderly woman from the plane. Blake watched, frozen, as William's face lit up with a warm smile. He walked over to the woman and extended his arms for an affectionate hug. "Mom," "I'm so glad you arrived safely," he said with a voice full of warmth. Blake felt the ground shift beneath his feet, as though the impact of the situation had physically hit him. He tried to process what was happening. The elderly woman he had so coldly ignored was none other than his boss's mother. Still in shock, Blake stood still, pretending to be occupied with his luggage. But it was impossible not to hear the conversation between William and his mother. "Are you feeling better? Was the flight smooth?" William asked with genuine concern. The woman, looking more composed, replied, "Yes, I'm fine now. It was a bit turbulent, but I made it." Blake felt William's gaze briefly pass over him. There was no immediate greeting, which only heightened his anxiety. Did she tell him what happened on the plane? Blake wondered, as sweat began to bead on his forehead. He took a step back, trying to distance himself without drawing attention. But before he could leave, William noticed him. "Blake, you're here too." Blake felt the air grow heavier as William, with a welcoming smile, made the introduction. "Blake, this is my mother, Agnes," he said proudly, gently holding her arm. Agnes looked directly at Blake, and in that instant, time seemed to freeze. There was something in her eyes that made him feel small, as if his behavior on the flight was being replayed in that one piercing look. "It's a pleasure to meet you," Blake said, forcing a smile that failed to hide his tension. Agnes, however, remained silent for a few seconds, making the situation even more uncomfortable. She tilted her head slightly as if recognizing him, but didn't step forward or extend her hand for a greeting. Instead, she said calmly, "Let's go, William. I'm tired and prefer not to linger." Her tone was cold but controlled, carrying a firmness that made Blake's heart race. He knew that her comment was more than a polite request to leave. It was a clear message. She knew exactly who he was. William, seemingly unaware of the tension, helped Agnes adjust her coat and picked up her luggage while chatting casually about the day. Blake remained motionless, observing everything, trying to discern if Agnes had shared anything with her son. But Agnes was discreet. As she walked alongside William, she cast one final, lingering look at Blake, one that was equally piercing. It was as if she was scrutinizing every detail of him, wordlessly. Agnes's face remained calm, but her eyes spoke volumes. Blake felt exposed, as though she knew exactly who he was inside and was waiting for the right moment to act. William, sensing the discomfort in the air, tried to ease the situation. "Blake, I hope you had a good flight. See you at the office tomorrow. We have a lot to discuss." Blake nodded, trying to exude confidence, but inside he felt the weight of what had just transpired. Blake tried to steady his breathing as he watched William and Agnes walk away through the airport terminal. His heart pounded, but as their footsteps grew more distant, he began convincing himself that his worries might be exaggerated. She didn't say anything. There wasn't even a mention of the flight, he thought, adjusting his blazer and trying to regain his composure. As he straightened his suitcase, Blake analyzed William's behavior. He seemed absolutely normal, as though he knew nothing about what had happened hours earlier on the plane. William's usual cordiality and professionalism reinforced the idea that Agnes had chosen not to reveal the embarrassing details of their encounter. This thought brought a brief sense of relief to Blake, who took a deep breath, feeling that everything might be under control. "That's it," he murmured to himself, almost convinced. She probably understood it was just a misunderstanding. Nothing to worry about. With that reasoning, Blake squared his shoulders and headed toward the airport exit, forcing himself to focus on the purpose of his trip. The important negotiation awaiting him the next day. He needed to be at his best, and letting himself be shaken by something that seemed resolved was, in his view, a waste of time. However, as Blake walked through the airport, something nagged at him. No matter how much he tried to convince himself that the situation was resolved, the image of Agnes's piercing eyes lingered. He couldn't forget the way she had looked at him, as if she had decided something about him that had yet to be revealed. That thought flared in his mind like a spark he tried to extinguish, but it always reignited. As he got into the taxi that would take him to the hotel, Blake glanced out the window and saw William and Agnes getting into another car. He squinted, trying to see if they were talking, but the distance made it impossible to discern their expressions. "Let it go," he muttered to himself quietly, as if trying to convince himself it was the best choice. As the taxi moved through the streets, Blake leaned back in his seat, letting out a long sigh. He needed rest, mental preparation, and focus on what truly mattered. In his mind, the worst seemed to be over. Yet even as he tried to believe that, the idea that the encounter at the airport was just the beginning echoed in his thoughts, a reminder that things don't always stay buried as we might wish. And Blake, though he didn't know it yet, was about to learn that the hard way. The next morning, Blake arrived at the office with a determined stride and his mind set on the day ahead, a day he believed would be pivotal for his career. Adjusting his suit, he took a deep breath before stepping into William's conference room. He was confident that his presentation and the strategies he had developed would be enough to convince the hesitant partners. After all, he had been dedicated to this project for months. William greeted him with a polite smile, but there was something different about his demeanor. He seemed more serious, more thoughtful than usual. Blake sat down and began outlining his ideas, but before he could get far into his introduction, William interrupted him with a calm yet firm gesture. "Blake, I need to address something important before we proceed," William said, leaning slightly in his chair. Blake immediately became alert, feeling a twinge of unease. This negotiation has been more challenging than we anticipated, and honestly, we've reached an impasse. The partners are resistant, and it seems our approaches aren't delivering the desired results. Blake furrowed his brow, surprised by the statement. He was about to argue that his strategy just needed more time, but William continued before he could speak. "I believe we need a fresh perspective to unlock this situation. And this is where someone very special to me comes in. My mother, Agnes." At the mention of her name, Blake's stomach churned. He swallowed hard, trying to maintain a neutral expression. William didn't seem to notice his reaction. "My mother is one of the best negotiators I know," William continued, smiling with admiration. "She and my father built this company from the ground up, and even in retirement, her experience and insight remain unparalleled. I believe that with her help, we can overcome the barriers we're facing." A wave of heat rushed over Blake's body. His mind raced in 100 directions. The thought of working directly with Agnes, especially after what had happened on the plane, was simply unbearable. He struggled to maintain composure as William looked at him, awaiting a response. "Of course," Blake replied in a controlled tone that masked the turmoil within. "If you believe her experience can make a difference, I'm ready to collaborate." William nodded, satisfied. "Great. We'll schedule a meeting later today to discuss the next steps. My mother will be joining us shortly." Blake forced a smile but felt sweat beginning to gather at the back of his neck. He knew he was about to face Agnes again, this time in a setting where she would have total control. No matter how much he tried to ignore it, the memory of her coldness at the airport still haunted him. He couldn't deny that he was entering delicate territory, and each passing second heightened the sense that this wouldn't end well. But there was no turning back. William's invitation was, in truth, a ticket to a lesson Blake wasn't ready to learn. Blake entered the meeting room with his heart racing, clutching his folder of notes as if it were a shield. He had spent the morning trying to mentally prepare for the moment, but nothing felt sufficient. When the door closed behind him, the silence in the room became almost tangible. At the center, sitting impeccably upright, was Agnes. Her gaze, steady and analytical, locked on him for a moment, assessing him without haste before shifting to the papers on the table. "Good morning, Blake," she said in a calm voice, but one that carried an intangible weight. He replied with a hurried, "Good morning," trying to maintain a professional tone. Agnes gave a slight nod and gestured toward the chair in front of her. He sat down slowly, as if stepping onto thin ice. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Agnes picked up a pair of glasses from the table, put them on, and began reviewing the documents with almost intimidating concentration. Blake watched, unable to relax. The sound of pages turning seemed louder than it should have. He wanted to break the silence, but every time he opened his mouth, it felt as though his words would catch in his throat. Her gaze, still fixed on the papers, finally lifted to meet his. It was a look that didn't need words to convey authority. "So, this is the plan you believe is suitable to resolve the situation?" she asked, her tone neutral but loaded with expectation. Blake nodded, trying to project confidence. Yes, I believe this approach is the best to convince the partners. Agnes didn't respond immediately. Instead, she flipped through the papers again, as if searching for something. Interesting, she said finally, but it was unclear if that was a compliment or a critique. Blake began speaking, trying to explain the details of the plan, but she interrupted him with a subtle hand gesture. Before you explain, let's review the numbers and the logic behind them. I want to understand how you arrived at these conclusions. He swallowed hard, pulling out his own papers to follow along. As Agnes read, Blake felt each second stretch into eternity. The silence in the room was so dense it seemed as if the air had grown heavier. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, adjusting his shirt collar. Her calm gaze occasionally lifted to meet his directly, as if she were studying not just the documents but also the person before her. Blake tried to maintain his composure, but the growing tension was undeniable. He knew that Agnes wasn't just William's mother, but someone with years of experience and authority. Each look she gave him felt like proof that she knew more than she was letting on, as if she had already identified flaws he had yet to see. When Agnes finally closed the folder, the sound echoed through the room like a period at the end of a sentence. "Very well, Blake," she said with an unreadable expression. "Let's see how we can adjust this to make it truly effective." Blake nodded quickly, but inside he felt defeated. The silence and tension of that meeting weren't just uncomfortable. They were a silent demonstration of who was really in control. He knew that from now on, every word and decision would be closely scrutinized by Agnes, and that left him more insecure than ever. Blake left the meeting with Agnes feeling a mix of frustration and indignation. As he walked down the corridor toward his office, her words echoed in his mind. "We need to adjust this to make it more effective." He thought about how much effort he had put into the plan, analyzing every detail and crafting a strategy he believed was flawless. But Agnes, with her calm demeanor and razor-sharp words, seemed to have dismantled everything in just a few minutes. Seated at his desk, Blake reread his notes and compared them to Agnes's comments. "She's just trying to assert her authority," he thought, gripping his pen tightly. To him, her suggestions were nothing more than an attempt to prove she was still in control, perhaps even a form of revenge for what had happened on the plane. "She wants me to fail so that it looks like only her plan works," he concluded, convinced this was her true motivation. Blake decided he wouldn't follow Agnes's ideas. He firmly believed his original plan was superior, more direct and aligned with the numbers the partners needed to see. "They don't want speeches or feelings," he muttered to himself. "They want clear, objective results." He spent the rest of the afternoon making minor tweaks to his presentation, but kept the core of his strategy intact. Each time he reread Agnes's suggestions, he felt more determined to prove her wrong. In the following days, Blake avoided direct meetings with Agnes, opting for brief and impersonal messages instead. He justified his decisions as strategic adjustments, but was in fact sticking to his original plan and ignoring her advice altogether. The tension between them was palpable. Blake knew William was watching closely, but he felt that as long as he delivered results, there would be no room for criticism. What Blake didn't realize was that his resistance went beyond a mere professional matter. He was letting his insecurity and pride take over, blinding him to the fact that Agnes had decades of experience in negotiations in a perspective he couldn't fully grasp. For him, accepting her plan would feel like admitting defeat, something his ego wasn't ready to face. Convinced of his decision, Blake scheduled the final meeting with the partners to present his strategy. He believed that with confidence and determination, he could persuade anyone. "They'll see that my plan is the only viable solution," he said to himself as he adjusted his tie in the mirror. But what he didn't know was that his choice to disregard Agnes's advice was about to trigger consequences he could never have foreseen. His dismissal of her suggestions wouldn't just put the business at risk, it would also jeopardize his own position in the company. The conference room was immaculate. The polished table reflected the ceiling lights, while the company's partners settled into their leather chairs. There was a palpable tension in the air, and Blake felt the mounting pressure, but remained determined to showcase his vision. He walked into the room with a confident stride that bordered on arrogance. Dressed in his best suit, he believed it symbolized the success he was about to demonstrate. Agnes was already seated, calmly reviewing some notes. Unlike Blake, her demeanor was composed. But there was something in her gaze that carried a silent warning. Blake chose to ignore it. To him, this meeting was his chance to prove that his plan was the best solution to the impasse, without relying on suggestions he deemed outdated and unnecessary. "Gentlemen, thank you for being here today," Blake began with a rehearsed smile. He connected his laptop to the projector and launched his presentation. The first slides displayed detailed graphs and carefully crafted financial projections. His voice was firm, almost theatrical, as if performing for an audience he needed to win over. "As you can see, this plan offers quick and measurable results," he said, highlighting the numbers on the screen. Some of the partners nodded while others exchanged uncertain glances. Blake, however, seemed indifferent to their reactions. He continued speaking with a confidence that made him seem unshakable. At a critical point in the presentation, Agnes raised her hand, signaling that she wanted to make an observation. "Blake," she began calmly, "did you consider the long-term impact of these projections, particularly regarding relationships with external partners?" Before she could continue, Blake interrupted. "With all due respect, Mrs. Agnes," he said in a tone that sounded more condescending than respectful, "these details aren't relevant to the focus of this presentation. What matters here are the immediate results." The room fell silent for a moment. Agnes leaned back in her chair, her eyes fixed on Blake, while the partners exchanged uncomfortable glances. One of them, visibly uneasy, cleared his throat and intervened. "Blake, I think we should hear what Agnes has to say. She has valuable experience that could help us avoid risks." Blake forced a smile and raised his hands in a gesture of apparent agreement. "Of course, but I believe my analysis already addresses all concerns." He quickly moved to the next slide, ignoring the comment and continuing to present his ideas. His tone became more insistent, as if trying to regain control of the room. Agnes, however, didn't need to say anything. Her calm presence and the attentive gazes of the partners were enough to show that Blake's attitude was not being well received. The confidence he displayed now seemed forced, and his insistence on ignoring others was starting to annoy even those who had initially seemed interested. As the meeting progressed, the discomfort in the room grew. Blake was unaware, but every interruption and dismissive gesture was eroding his credibility. When he finished the presentation, the silence was deafening. He expected applause, or at least consensus, but was met with blank stares and doubtful expressions. "We need to think about this," one of the partners said, his tone leaving no room to hide his dissatisfaction. Another simply shook his head, while Agnes, without saying a word, closed her notebook. To Blake, this felt like the beginning of what he believed to be a victory. But in reality, he was closer to losing everything than he could have ever imagined. The meeting ended, and Blake left the room feeling exhausted but falsely convinced that his plan had been well received. He ignored the partners' evasive glances, focusing only on what he perceived as the positive points of his presentation. To him, the small criticisms were normal and nothing out of the ordinary. However, as he adjusted his tie and gathered his documents, Agnes remained in the room, calm, speaking quietly but firmly with the partners. Hours later, as Blake reviewed emails at his desk, William called him in for a conversation. His tone was neutral, but his serious expression revealed that something was amiss. Upon entering the office, Blake was met with a tense atmosphere. William held a printed document, and his mother, Agnes, sat beside him with a calm but focused demeanor. "Blake," William began, looking directly at him, "the partners have reviewed your proposal and decided not to move forward with it. They believe the risks outweigh the immediate benefits you presented." The words felt like a blow. Blake blinked, trying to process what he had just heard. He opened his mouth to argue, but William continued, giving him no chance to speak. "However," he added, leaning slightly forward, "they accepted another proposal, a plan that was revised to align the company's goals with the partners' expectations." Blake looked confused until William handed him the document. It was the reformulated proposal by Agnes. Blake's heart sank as he realized the highlighted points were exactly those he had ignored. Agnes, with her usual calmness, lifted her gaze to him and, without a hint of arrogance, said, "The partners needed something that demonstrated not just numbers, but a clear vision of partnership. They were concerned about the long-term impact on the relationship." Blake felt a lump in his throat. He knew he had dismissed her suggestions out of pride. "But I reviewed everything," he tried to justify, his voice trembling. "The numbers were solid and my analysis was straightforward." "They were solid, yes," Agnes replied serenely. "But they lacked what the partners were most seeking: security and confidence that this partnership would be beneficial in every aspect. It's not just about closing a deal, Blake. It's about understanding the people on the other side of the table." William paused, observing Blake. He knew the young executive was dedicated and hardworking, but his ego and lack of flexibility had cost them dearly. "Thanks to my mother's plan," William continued, "the negotiation was saved and the company's reputation preserved. But we need to reflect on the impact your decisions had on this process." Blake felt the weight of William's words like a verdict. He had ignored valuable advice, underestimated Agnes's experience, and ultimately put everything at risk. Now he faced a lesson he could not avoid. The success of the negotiation was guaranteed, but for him, the real challenge was just beginning. Dealing with the consequences of his choices and facing the truth about himself. Blake entered William's office the next morning with hesitant steps. The atmosphere was heavy, and he knew the reason for the meeting was not positive. William sat behind his desk, his expression serious, while Agnes, once again impeccably composed, sat in a chair beside him, flipping through a notebook as if it were just another day. The silence was deafening. "Blake," William began, looking him directly in the eye, "I want to acknowledge something before we continue. You are a dedicated and hardworking professional. Your ability to pursue results is something I admire. But unfortunately, that's not all that's expected from a leader." Blake's heart raced. He opened his mouth to try to justify himself, but William raised his hand, signaling for him to listen. "What happened in this negotiation reflects something larger. You have talent, but your ego and inability to listen have cost us dearly. If it weren't for my mother's plan, we would be facing an irreparable failure right now." The words hit Blake like a punch to the stomach. He knew he had made mistakes, but hearing this from William, someone he deeply respected, hurt more than he had imagined. "I want to learn from this, William," Blake replied, his voice hesitant. "I want to make things right." William sighed and shook his head slightly. "I believe you do, Blake, but sometimes learning involves accepting that there are consequences. And in this case, those consequences are unavoidable. I can't keep you in the company." Blake was stunned. He opened his mouth again but found no words. The decision was final, and he knew it. William continued, "I hope this serves as an opportunity for you to reflect, grow, and become the leader I know you can be. But for now, we need to go our separate ways." As William finished speaking, Agnes, who had remained silent until then, looked up and addressed Blake. "I never told my son what happened on the plane," she began, her voice firm but not hostile. "Not because I wanted to protect you, but because I believe certain lessons must come directly from life. Your attitude at that moment was just a reflection of something greater, how you see people and how you value, or fail to value, those around you." Blake averted his gaze, feeling the weight of her words. "Respect and humanity, Blake," Agnes continued, "are qualities that not only make a leader better, but also shape who you are as a person. If you learn this, you may be able to turn this moment into something positive." Visibly emotional, William stood up and extended his hand to Blake. "I hope our paths cross again someday when you're ready for something greater. I believe in second chances, but for now, you need to find your own." Blake shook his former boss's hand and looked at Agnes, who maintained a steady, yet non-hostile gaze. He knew he had much to rethink. At that moment, Blake didn't just lose a job. He had to face the consequences of his arrogance and the need to change, not just professionally, but as a person. Blake left William's office with slow steps, the weight of the conversation still pressing on his shoulders. He carried with him not just the pain of a dismissal, but also the realization that this was the inevitable consequence of his choices. Still, William's words echoed in his mind, planting a seed of reflection he knew he couldn't ignore. As he walked down the corridor, Blake heard the sound of lively voices coming from the main room. The team was celebrating the closing of the deal he had once believed was unattainable. He hesitated for a moment, watching from a distance the euphoric energy that filled the room. Everyone was laughing, toasting, and exchanging congratulations. But the center of attention was Agnes. Surrounded by partners and colleagues, her serene demeanor contrasted with the excitement around her. There was no sign of excessive pride, just the quiet satisfaction of someone who knew they had done the right thing. William appeared behind Blake, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. "You've done many good things here, Blake," he said, with a sincerity that made the young executive look up. "That's something no one can take away from you. But the greatest work you need to do now isn't in spreadsheets or negotiations. It's within yourself." Blake nodded, absorbing every word. William continued, "Don't let this moment define who you are forever. Everyone has the capacity to change and grow. And when you do, who knows? Our paths might cross again in a way that benefits not just you, but everyone around you." William's words, though firm, carried a kindness that deeply touched Blake. He extended his hand to his former boss, and the handshake was more than a gesture of farewell. It was a silent promise that he would try to be better. As Blake left the building for the last time, he didn't look back. Instead, his thoughts were focused on the future and what needed to be done to rebuild what he felt he had lost. Not just his career, but his view of himself. Inside the company, the celebration continued. Agnes's name was repeated among the toasts, each compliment reinforcing the importance of her wisdom and experience. Standing beside his mother, William made sure to say aloud, "It's thanks to her that we're celebrating today. There's always so much to learn from people with the vision and empathy she's demonstrated." Agnes simply smiled, acknowledging the gratitude with a subtle gesture. As the team celebrated, she gazed out the window toward the horizon, as if knowing the impact of her lesson didn't end there. Outside that building, there was someone deeply reflecting, someone she believed could change for the better. This story teaches us that true success isn't solely about technical skills or professional achievements, but about how we treat others and deal with our own limitations. Blake discovered that arrogance and ego can be greater obstacles than any external challenge, while Agnes's experience and humanity showed that respect, empathy, and wisdom are the pillars of lasting relationships and accomplishments. In life, the most valuable lessons often come from our mistakes. Recognizing our faults, listening to those with something to teach, and being willing to change are attitudes that shape not only our professional journey, but also define who we are as human beings. After all, real success is built on character, humility, and respect for others. Did you enjoy this story? Share it. Help spread this inspiring message and touch someone's heart today. Just click share to let others experience this impactful story.